But first tonight, the knives are out for Anthony Albanese, with a senior Labor operative unleashing on the Prime Minister and his cabinet. The extraordinary assessment comes as United States officials released a statement expressing serious concern about the Chinese warship's attack on our Navy divers, the incident that Albanese didn't even bother to raise with Xi Jinping. It was a week ago today when a Chinese warship injured Australian divers using sonar weapons. The very next day, Anthony Albanese flew to San Francisco for APEC, where he met on the sidelines with none other than the Chinese President Xi Jinping. Look at this footage of Albanese approaching Xi from behind, knowing he was being filmed. And just 2 days earlier, Xi's Navy had deliberately threatened ours in what Deputy PM Richard Marles describes as a dangerous and unprofessional act, and one sailor was injured. And here was our Prime Minister just bounding up to the Chinese President, acting like they're old mates. As you can see, he went out of his way to go up to Xi to give the impression that they're friends who can now chat like buddies. And yet, it has now become crystal clear that Albanese did not mention the incident when he came face to face with Xi. Nothing. Opposition leader Peter Dutton today said the Prime Minister should apologise for not raising this attack with China directly.
The PM gets tricky with his words. I think the test here is whether he can just be upfront and honest and open. Did he say, these words to President Xi, or if not, if he didn't, then apologise. Just admit you've made a mistake, but be honest.
And you'd think Albanese should apologise at the very least to the Navy divers. The divers have the courage to fight for our country, but the Prime Minister doesn't even have the courage to raise this verbally with the Chinese President and Premier. In fact, the government completely withheld this critical national security detail from the public so that Albanese could avoid answering questions from journalists. He stood up on Saturday morning our time in San Francisco and held a press conference where he boasted about his meeting with President Xi, but he kept secret the attack on our Navy personnel.
Prime Minister, we saw a nice moment where you got up at the table there, went over to the President of China, shook his hand, spoke to him for a brief moment, 100 minutes. Obviously important that you keep the goodwill going that you struck with him in China.
Yes, and indeed after the summit finished as well, I had a much longer conversation with the President and with Wang Yi as well. He regards my visit there as being very successful. We reiterated the stabilisation that is occurring, and of course our trade, the removal of any of the remaining trade impediments is very much in Australia's interest, but it was positive.
And then about an hour after his private plane had taken off, came the statement publicly about the incident. This is sneaky stage management. It's led to accusations from press gallery veterans of secrecy and a lack of transparency. And that press conference that you just saw, that was Saturday morning, our time. It's now Tuesday evening, and the Prime Minister has only done one media interview in all of that time. And in that interview, he said the attack was raised during the usual channels. Well, as Liberal Senator James Paterson said yesterday, there's no point in the Prime Minister being overseas so much, travelling so extensively, if he isn't going to stand up for our interests, our sovereignty and our values. And then this from Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie and the Australian's foreign editor Greg Sheridan today.
He had an opportunity last week at APEC to raise this very significant incident with Xi Jinping, and it turns out, well, it appears that he did not. And so now we have the Chinese government deflecting and indeed, you could say, gaslighting us. Well, to use the Prime Minister's own formulation, cooperate where we can, disagree where we must. This was a moment to disagree and do so peer-to-peer, man-to-man with the leader of the Chinese government, Xi Jinping. We had divers under the hull of HMAS Toowoomba conducting risky risky work on the propellers, cutting away fishing nets, and they were subject to a sonar attack from a Chinese warship. It's unacceptable.
I mean, the Prime Minister's not talking to God here. He's talking to another head of government about an aggressive military action they've taken, which has injured one of our sailors. I also think the Albanese government is increasingly transparent in its dismal political management of these issues. This stabilised relationship has got nothing at all to do with Australian diplomacy, nothing at all. It's China deciding that it's spent a few years punishing us and then it decided to take us out of the punishment zone. And it's then saying, and if you want to remain out of the punishment zone, you've got to behave like a proper poodle and not ever raise anything disagreeable with us.
Look, the Prime Minister is now under so much pressure over this that he's said to have cancelled his cybersecurity announcement that was planned for today, just so that he didn't have to face questions from the media.
I don't see why he can't go into any further detail about this, and I think it's a pretty fine distinction which is being drawn about the nature of the meeting, which seems pretty conveniently to line up with the Prime Minister's political interest, which is to refuse to have to answer questions about this.
The attack by the Chinese warship is so serious that the United States Foreign Relations Committee chair released this statement. It said China's latest provocation on the high seas, this time directed at Australia, is more than risky operational behaviour. It's an act of aggression undertaken in international waters. Lines must be drawn and enforced. Well, China has had no problems raising this publicly, incorrectly saying that Australia provoked this attack and was encroaching on China's national security. But it's clear that the Prime Minister right now is showing that he is being subservient to China. It is a sign of weakness. And more broadly speaking, there's more signals that the government's unity is unravelling further. Today, Labor campaign operative and former Chief of Staff for Bill Shorten, Cameron Milner, penned a damning report on the Prime Minister. The former Queensland Labor Secretary, who's worked on about 33 federal, state and local campaigns, wrote a piece saying that Albanese is travelling the globe as a latter-day Neil Armstrong and has not been in the country enough for a leader supposedly dealing with a cost of living crisis. He says that Albanese looks out of touch when Australians are hurting so much. If not for the parliamentary sitting dates, Albo would no doubt find anywhere else but Australia to fly in his plush Airbus he reportedly calls Toto 1, named after his COVID-era pet dog. Well, Albo sure doesn't want to know what life is like back here in Australia. When was the last time you saw the Prime Minister take a street walk and meet real Australians doing it tough? Well, Cameron Milner then takes aim at some of the Prime Minister's hapless ministers. He says of Tony Burke that he's been credentialing himself about the pro-Palestine ALP rank and file by not contesting the term genocide and failing to condemn an imam in his local area who was calling for jihad. Of the Treasurer Jim Chalmers, Milner says that his weekend glossy magazine profile looked like an application for the top job. Of Penny Wong, he rightly accuses her of saying that Hamas terrorists had been murdered. What nonsense. And Milner says there's speculation she may be looking to quit politics. On Richard Marles, Milner points out that if he were then to take Penny Wong's job as Foreign Affairs Minister, he'd have more time to play golf while using Avalon's international runway for his return trip to his long-suffering electors of Corio. And Cameron Milner, like the political editors for the major papers, he also thinks that there's a chance Albanese could lose the next election, just like he managed to lose support for the Voice referendum, which initially had majority support. It's clear Albanese is running out of steam. He doesn't want to face the media. The scandals are growing. And now there's even talk that he might cancel the last sitting week of Parliament on December 7 because there's just not enough legislation for the government to do that week. David Crowe reports in the Sydney Morning Herald that the last day of Parliament could be November the 30th. He says that would be a wonderful outcome for MPs who wouldn't prefer to go to Christmas drinks in the electorate rather than listening to the bells ring in Parliament. But it raises a question about Albanese and his cabinet. What does his government stand for? Is it losing energy? And on top of all of this, today the minutes from the RBA were released and they reveal that yet another rate rise is on the cards. And this would be the 14th. The new RBA Governor, Michelle Bullock, has also criticised the government's high immigration strategy in a speech, saying that there's not enough housing supply or infrastructure. She's also warned that wages growth at 4% is too high and could hamper the fight against inflation. And these are just two examples where government policy is working against the RBA's objective to deal with inflation. And as a result, inflation isn't coming down. It's not coming down fast enough. It's sticky, might even be entrenched now. And we're looking at more rate rises on the horizon. Just weeks out from Christmas, families and businesses are seriously struggling. And today, on the 18-month anniversary of Albanese's election victory, an election, by the way, where he campaigned primarily on what he called the cost of living crisis, well, we've had another 12 rate hikes since then. If it was a crisis back then, Prime Minister, what is it now?